there, Booksy. Welcome back to my channel. It is December 16th. I don't know. It's sometime past the middle of the month, and I'm just starting my December reading vlog because, well, you know, I got married last week. And so my reading took a real nosedive before the wedding, during the wedding, of course, and right after the wedding. I read nothing. So I'm just here to tell you about the first book that I finished in December, which is The Adults by Harlem. It's a NetGalley electronic arc that I read, and it was a delightful beginning to the new reading month. It's about two couples. One of them, well, two couples that are related because two of them are ex-spouses. So Matt and Claire used to be married. They have a 7-year-old daughter named Scarlett, and they came up with a brilliant idea to spend Christmas together with their child and their new relationship partners, and combine how dramatic Christmas could be by itself with two couples that are still not quite over each other. And they also have additional secrets in terms of relationships and in terms of secrets that they're just carrying about their lives and their plans and their goals, and it's told in alternating perspectives and interspersed with this dialogue and interview that is surrounding an incident that happens during the Christmas vacation. A lot of that storytelling technique reminds me of Big Little Lies by Leanne Moriarty, which was one of my favorite books a couple of years ago. So this for me was a really great read. I would recommend it. I gave it a glowing review on my blog, and I'll link the post down below if you want to read more of my thoughts about it. I love the fact that there are three couples. I only mentioned 5 people I know, but the 7-year-old girl has an imaginary friend named Posey, and she speaks to her imaginary friend much more than she speaks to some of the adults. And so while these three unlikely couples are on this vacation, there's a lot of different dynamics between them. It's lovely. So that's the first book that I finished.
Lord forgive me for all my sins.
So that's the first book that I finished. I gave it 4 stars, even though I'm still thinking that it might deserve a little bit more. We'll come back to that later. I reserve the right, of course, to change my rating as the month goes by. But before I wrap up this segment, I want to tell you a little bit about the characters and why I found them so delightful. So the couple that used to be married, the exes, are Matt and Claire. Matt is a bumbling 30-something-year-old recreational drug user, happy-go-lucky type, and the yin to his yang is Claire, his ex-wife, who's a lawyer, super organized, parent of the year, which makes it a little unreasonable why she was with Matt in the first place. But then you kind of think, okay, maybe she got together with him and he became this loafer, and so that's why she left him. Except her reasons for leaving him seem to not quite add up, because they knew each other when they were in college. They dated when they were in college. They were friends and they dated. They married. They had a child. Why would she leave him at this point? But then she leaves him for someone who's a lot more type A, a lot more aggressive. This super fitness 40-something-year-old man who's training for an Ironman. Except he's divorced. His teenage children don't speak to him. So something about her choice of Patrick, the fitness guru, over Matt, the skater boy type, doesn't quite add up, because neither one of them seems like the kind of person that Claire would choose for herself, considering how put together Claire is. Then in the mix we have Alex, who's Matt's new girlfriend. She's a scientist, and Scarlett, who's a 7-year-old child, and her imaginary rabbit named Posey. They're convinced that Alex is a murderer because they've heard about scientists who do experiments on animals. And as the story progresses, their suspicions are confirmed, because Alex does indeed kill during the beginning of the novel, not even quite in the climax. But whew, oh my. So Alex is the one who's asking all these questions, and the complication to her character is that she's a 30-something-year-old woman who is just so happy to be in a relationship that she probably didn't ask a lot of the questions that she was supposed to ask about Matt. And even when things start to not add up, even when her initial perceptions are proven false and she should leave Matt alone, she stays with him because, well, it's kind of hard sometimes to break up with a dad. A divorced dad is extremely popular, especially for a woman who wants to have family but doesn't necessarily want to have children herself. There's a lot about being a stepmother that is quite appealing. So add to this the fact that they're on a 5-day Christmas vacation. These people who seem to have no business spending Christmas together, and they're in a place where Matt and Claire vacationed together when they were married. There's a lot. There's a lot about this plot that is just ideally written, ideally conceptualized, that I really, really enjoyed. And so that's all that I can tell you about this story. I don't want to ruin it for you, but if you like Leon Moriarty's writing, where there are these short chapters that are interspersed with a running interview or police blotter kind of relation, then you'll enjoy this book. I did. I read Sea Prayer by Khaled Hosseini, and this is an illustrated poem illustrated by Dan Williams, and it is a poem. It is a single poem inspired by the story of a Syrian refugee who drowned on his way trying to find refuge. And in this book, Khaled Hosseini invents a father and son, where the father is speaking to his son about things that he wished his son remembered about their country, even as they are leaving, even as their present story is about war and refugees and trying to leave but not feeling welcome in any other country. He's trying to also give an oral history of their life, of their family, of their country to his son, hoping that in some way this conversation will help preserve some memories that he knows his son is not old enough to remember. And so in this, he talks about having brought his son to his father's house, to the summers of his childhood and his grandfather's farmhouse, and what life was like before the wars, when he says, we woke in the mornings to the stirring of olive trees and the breeze, to the bleating of your grandmother's goat and the clanking of her cooking pots. And you know, it requires silence to be able to hear those things. To be able to hear goats bleating in the distance means that your home is pretty silent, is pretty quiet, is pretty peaceful. And he knows, this father knows, that his son will never know that reality, because for him, the story is now one of bombs and people running and people being chased and war. And so the poem is very profound. What it lacks in text, there you can read between the lines, you can get a lot of meaning, a lot of emotion, a lot of reflection. And so while this book doesn't have a lot of words, what the author does give us is very profound, very impactful, and you can get a lot of the emotion that the narrator is trying to convey to his son, but also to the reader, to inspire us to feel something for these refugees. And so while it's not a big book, and I'm not sure if it does justify the $15 price, it is a very good read, and one that you can finish in just a few minutes. I read Jhumpa Lahiri's The Lowland, and this one is a book that I have had on my shelf for a really long time. In fact, it's one of the books that I predicted I would rate 5 stars, and I don't think that it deserves 5 stars, but it is a strong 4 and maybe even a 4.5. There's a lot that I really enjoyed about this book. Jhumpa Lahiri is one of my favorite writers. She wrote the short story collection, The Interpreter of Maladies, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and I've been wanting to model my writing after hers ever since I read that collection. In this one, she narrates the story of 2 brothers. They are raised as though they're twins, but they're 15 months apart. And because of the closeness of their age, they have very similar experiences, but the one who's older finds himself sometimes living in his brother's shadow. And so it talks about this divergence of experience as well as the similarities that these 2 brothers have in how they're treated by their parents, in some of the things that they do. And as they get older and their needs change and their personalities change and their reactions to the political situation in their country changes and their ambitions for the future also change, we get to see how these two brothers who have very similar beginnings, what kind of choices they make and how it impacts their lives, but also the other brother and the rest of their family members. The brothers are born and raised in a Calcutta neighborhood, and as they get older they realize that their neighborhood really doesn't have what they would like to get from life, and so they decide to strike out on their own. And even as they discuss leaving, each brother is a little resentful of the other person's intentions, but they decide to leave anyway. And one goes away from their home but remains in Calcutta. The other one comes to the United States and goes to Rhode Island to study. And so within that story, Lahiri explores the different opportunities that were available to young, ambitious Indian men in the mid-1900s. What was it like to remain at home and get involved in the revolution, get involved in political struggle as India was trying to assert its independence over Britain? And what was it like for someone who decided not to stay there but come to the United States and get caught up in the civil rights movement and experience the prejudice and experience some of the racial profiling, but also the wealth of opportunities that were available once one was able to overcome the struggles that were associated with being an immigrant and experiencing the oppression of racism. So in this one, she gave us split narratives, at one point following one brother, at another point following the other brother, and at some point following the woman who bonded these two men. And I don't want to say too much about this story because this is one of those novels that the less you know about it going in, the better. The better the experience, the better the story can reveal itself organically. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot. I don't think it is a 5-star, but definitely a strong read and one that I would recommend, especially if you're a fan of books about immigrants, books about brothers, books about history and how history affects people in a personal way. Love this book, recommend it highly. This was one of my books. This was one of my favorite books of December. I finished reading Putney by Sofka Zinoviev. I think that's how you pronounce the name. Here's the cover just in case, because I'm not Greek. I actually don't have any Greek friends. So I had a Greek professor when I was in college, but let's focus. I finished reading this, which is a modern take. Modern, not so modern. This is kind of a retelling of Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, which I read earlier this year. And so when I spoke about Lolita, and I did a kind of buddy read of Lolita with my friend Tiffany from Hierarchy of Reads. Hi, Tiffany. And so we decided to read this retelling because we wanted to kind of follow up with what this author would do with that utterly revolting and utterly repulsive, but also utterly brilliant story. And I think she hit it out of the park. I think she did a really great job with this one. I don't want to tell you too much. If you're not familiar with the story of Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, it's about a older man who inherits a little girl because her mother is not able to care for her, and he kind of grooms her over the years to convince her that being with him and being in this terrible relationship with him is better than her being in foster care. The difference with this book is that the young girl is living in a house with her nuclear family. Her mother is there, her father is there, her older brother is there, and none of them seem concerned about the relationship that she develops with this man, a friend of her father's, a business partner and collaborator of her father. They're both composers, and he has relationships with every person in her family, and yet, or maybe because of that, no one suspects him. But the story is different in that we meet the Lolita character, the girl whose name is Daphne. We meet her when she's an older person. She's a middle-aged woman. She's a mother. She has friends. She's kept in touch, or well, she gets back in touch with a friend from her childhood. And together they decide to confront Ralph, who is the pedophile with whom she had the inappropriate relationship when she was a child. And now in their later years, they're deciding whether or not to press charges against Ralph. Kind of a take on the Me Too movement. And this book really brought out a lot of the highlights of that movement. It brought out maybe the concern that a person might have for outing someone who's now publicly known, well known, respected in his field for his other accomplishments, but still knowing that he needs to be held accountable for crimes that he committed in his earlier years. And I thought that the author did a really good job of that. She set this book in London and Greece. And so she incorporated some Greek mythology in here. There's a lot of literary references in here. And she also accomplished what I consider to be Nabokov's brilliance in Lolita. You know what Ralph is doing is wrong. Heinous crimes on many levels. Number one, Daphne is a child. She is 8 years old when he meets her. And he grooms her over a period of time. You know that the parents leaving her in his care doesn't mean that he has carte blanche to do whatever he wants with her. He's also a married man and a father in his own right. And so you know that him endangering the welfare of a child is just heinous. And yet the author draws you into the story so that the reader is at all points conflicted. You want the story to continue. You want to see what he's going to do next. And so even when there would be people who would be suspicious, like there's a scene in here where Ralph is accompanying Daphne on a trip, which just baffles me that her parents allow this unrelated man to take their minor child on an international trip, unescorted. But aside from that, they meet up on one of her family members, and this woman is very suspicious. Like, you see the suspicion in her eyes, the description of her narrowing her eyes and trying to wonder who this man is. And yet, when she walks away, the reader feels a little bit of relief that the story can continue. So I think that the author did a really good job in mirroring Nabokov's ability to pull the reader into a story that makes you feel dirty for wanting to read this book, but it was just such a beautifully written, beautifully expressed thematic study of crime and criminalization and the idea that everyone is a crime or victim, and even the victims are also perpetrating crimes of their own. It mirrored the idea of the sins of the father being visited on the children. And I loved a lot about this book. I read this again with Tiffany from Hierarchy of Reads, and I don't think we ever did our final wrap up because I was pushing to finish this before the end of the year and she was a little bit busier. So I read this and then went on to read something else because I didn't want this to be the last book that I read in 2018. But yeah, so this is Putney. I recommend it. I recommend it highly. If you read this book, I would love to talk to you about it. I don't want to tell you too much more about this story. There are characters in here that are very unlikable, and Ralph, being a child molester, a pedophile, and a predator, is not the most unlikable character. So it really toys with the idea of characterization and what you get from a novel as a reader. Highly recommend this one. I'm a little emotional because I think I finished reading my last book of the year, and it's The Conservationist by Nadine Gordimer. And this is a novel, this is one of my Man Booker Prize winning novels. I don't know if I'm emotional because I know that this is the last book that I'm reading for 2018, or if it is the confirmation that I'm not going to finish my 2018 Man Booker Reading Challenge because it's the last day of the year. And I've only read 20-something of the 50-something books that I plan to read from the Man Booker winning list. So let's just talk about this book and forget about all the books that I didn't read. So The Conservationist is set in South Africa, set in the apartheid regime in South Africa. And the main character is a white man. His name is Mering, and he's a little disconnected from his life. He's a farmer. So no, he's not a farmer, but he's bought a farm, a huge farm, and he's hired a black man named Jacobus to be like the overseer. And Jacobus is running things. It's interesting, the description of agriculture in this regime, because it sounds a lot like the absentee landlord in the colonial period, which I guess that is the period that I'm reading about. The book is very atmospheric, and I guess it needs to be, because we're reading about a time and place and history that no longer exists. You know, apartheid was abolished, is that the word? But we don't live in that time and space anymore. But it begins this discussion about race and the different treatment and the different realities that are faced by blacks and whites in South Africa. The big event that happens in this book is Merrin goes to visit the farm, goes to see what's up on his property. That is when he sees the children playing with the pale freckled eggs, and we get to think about what pale freckled eggs could be a metaphor for, in the fact that we have this book that is comparing the identity of white versus black in a very white dominated but black majority setting. It brings this situation to the forefront that when Merrin goes to visit the farm, Jacobus reports that a dead body has been found on the property, a black dead man who no one knows. And Jacobus, in distancing himself away from the identity of the victim, but also from the possibility of any interaction with the criminals, shows a lot about the reality of life in this regime, life on this farm, the life that Merrin has, where he seems to be responsible for things, and he seems to be being pulled into the vertex and vortex of situations, but he's also very clueless. His family relationships indicate that he's not connected. He's not connected to his wife, she's left him. He's not connected to his son, who may or may not be gay and refuses to acknowledge it to his father. And even the relationships that he should have with his peers are all lacking. And so in this novel, the author really paints this very important and interesting picture about the reality of the whites in the apartheid regime. And I don't know, I'm still thinking about this book. I know I'm going to be rereading this in 2019 because I'm going to be trying to read the Man Booker Prize winners again. More on that later, I guess. Maybe by the time you're watching this video, I'd have talked about it. But I'm looking forward to rereading this and discussing it, because I think I need to know a little bit more about South Africa and about the realities of apartheid to really get everything that this book was talking about. But in my first read, my first introduction to Nadine Gordimer as a writer, and I enjoyed it. So we'll talk more about this and other books in upcoming videos. I think this is where I sign off for the end of 2018. Thanks for watching. Happy New Year to you, and we'll talk in the comments. So until next time, until next year, happy reading. Bye.